Good afternoon and welcome to African American Studies Now. This panel is part of a year-long event series at the University of Maryland. It is entitled Antiracism, Research, Teaching, and Public Engagement. It's sponsored by the English Department of the University and by the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies. We are devoting this year to foregrounding the ways in which our scholarship and teaching are part of the vital and long-term work of anti-racist teaching, scholarship, and practice. And even though I like to think that these goals are embedded in African American studies, we're highlighting today these practices to make ourselves more aware of the kind of work against racism that we do, and more deeply aware of how African American studies has always been at the forefront of anti-racist work. I like to think that one of the few advantages of the pandemic is that we get to reach beyond the University of Maryland to a larger audience and to create more public engagements with these communities. So welcome again to our panel. Be sure to look for us again in the spring, when we will present our spring roundtable on Black feminism, activism, and the 21st century. We have assembled a stellar cast of scholars that are working in Black feminism. I'm going to introduce each one of our panelists today very, very briefly, because they are actually going to do the work of introducing themselves. GerShun Avilez, Associate Professor in the University of Maryland in the English department, and one of the moderators for our panel today, works in contemporary African American literature and visual cultures. GerShun.
Hello, everyone.
Julius Fleming specializes in African diasporic literatures and cultures. Julius.
Hi, everybody.
Chad Infante researches Black and Indigenous US and Caribbean cultures. Hello, Chad.
Hello, good morning.
Marisa Parham is the Director of African American Digital Humanities. Marisa, say hello. Rion Scott is one of our fiction writers in the, there's Marisa. Okay, she raised eyebrows. Rion is a fiction writer in the creative writing program.
Hello, everybody.
And Cecilia Shelton, who works in the field of technical and professional communication with an emphasis on digital and cultural rhetorics. Cecilia.
Hi, everybody.
So the format for today is that after each panelist gives you a little bit of introduction to the intellectual journey that they have taken towards their work, we will stop and have a short discussion among the panelists, and then we will open up the Q&A to our audience. You can submit your question and you will be called on in the order that your question is posted. We also ask each panelist to begin today with a key word or phrase or image as a way of introducing their work. So we'll begin with GerShun.
Okay, thank you. So I'm GerShun Avilez, and I work at the intersection of Black studies and sexuality studies. And the key word that I want to put on the table today is queer vulnerability. And that's a lot of my work recently has revolved around ideas about queer vulnerability. And by that, I mean specific social practices, laws, and institutional policies that create a kind of precarity of queer life that magnifies or even redirects racial vulnerability. And by this, I mean kind of material threats, of course, but also threats of erasure and being disappeared from public record. So one of my larger questions is, how do sexual minorities fit into what we call Black freedom dreams? And I turn to artists and activists and to address this question. My point about queer vulnerability has enabled actually a diasporic focus in my recent work. We can just think easily of the violence against individuals such as Brian Williamson in Jamaica, David Kato in Uganda or Sakia Gunn in the United States, understand readily this idea of queer vulnerability and the fatal destruction of queer life. But even though queerness can mean different things in different contexts, in different national contexts, in different places, I do believe that thinking across borders and about sexual minorities across borders allows us to understand a different kinds of diasporic connection, a different way of thinking about connection outside of a particular nation state. So that's kind of my specific work. And besides that work, I also want to have us think about today the place of sexuality studies within Black studies historically. Thanks to the work of Black feminist thinkers, there have always been calls to prioritize considerations of gender and sexuality explicitly within Black studies. Thinking of people like Barbara Smith, Cheryl Clark, Audre Lorde, but even also male culture producers like James Baldwin or Marlon Riggs. These individuals have always called upon us to have a capacious sense of Black studies. And part of what I want to suggest is that Black studies now could put queerness at its center. The point here is not to displace certain subject positions for others, but instead to put queer modes of analysis, one that emphasize sexuality, but also non-normativity, alternative modes of recovery, alternative modes of expression and critique. Put those kinds of queer strategies, they could be the heart of the field explicitly. And that's because the field itself has always been outside of and questioning the norms of institutions, education, and politics. The project I'm outlining here briefly sheds light on the queerness of Black studies historically and today. Thanks.
Julius. Thank you.
So thanks so much for the introduction, Mary Helen. Thanks to you all for attending, and thanks to Tita and Karen in the center for hosting us. I will say that I miss being with colleagues physically, but also miss the snacks that the center always provides at events like this. So in the broadest sense, my research is interested in the twin relationship between the historical forms of violence that Black people have suffered and continue to suffer, and the forms of beauty and thought they create from within the enclosures of anti-Black oppression. I approach questions of Blackness, Black ontology, Black political culture, and Black cultural production from a vantage point that certainly recognizes the scale and historicity of anti-Black racial violence, but stops short of allowing that violence in all of its very real and lingering and gripping materiality to operate as the prevailing heuristic for my approach to Black thought, my practice of Black thinking. My work turns more specifically to the field of Black performance studies to engage this historical and dynamic entanglement of anti-Black terror and Black sociality as a problem for thought. My first book project, currently entitled Black Patience, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Refusal to Wait for Freedom, opens upon the storied grounds of my native home, Mississippi. As Nina Simone famously put it, everybody knows about Mississippi, goddamn. What Simone is gesturing toward, of course, is a global consciousness of Mississippi's unabashed commitment to anti-Black racial terror and discipline. And yet, in 1963, we find a Black theater troupe staging a production of Samuel Beckett's classic modernist play, Waiting for Godot, in a cotton field. Their production not only rejected white people's calls for civil rights activists and Black people to go slow or to be patient, but also offered up nuanced, embodied philosophies of race, time, and democracy that theorize freedom now as much as they demanded freedom now as a condition of Black political life. And so what I'm interested in here, and through the lens of performance studies, is not only the kind of political act of demanding freedom now, but also how that very act has a kind of philosophical potential to theorize something like race and time and democracy. I am as interested in my work in the beauty and politics of the work that this theatrical troupe and their audiences did in that field, as I am in the violent conditions that drove them there in the first place, or the extractive drives of capitalism that will compel some of them back the next morning to perform the exploitative labor of sharecropping. As more Black people are killed by police, as more CEOs pretend that finding Black talent is almost impossible, as the occupant of the White House refuses to condemn white supremacy, we see that Black people are still subjected to racial terror and violence. They are still being asked to be patient. And yet, when we think about the sheer beauty and complexity of work, much of it award-winning, by writers like Natasha Trethewey, Kiese Lemon, Jasmine Ward, all of whom hail from Mississippi, by the way, we know that the field of Black studies must concern itself with something more than anti-Black violence. We must embrace and honor the depth, the expanse, and the scale of Black people's imaginations, which have never been fully the hostage of white violence.
Thanks, Julius. And our next speaker is Chad Infante.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. So my key terms that I want to start off with is right at the intersection of Black and Native literature are solidarity / syncretism. I prefer the term syncretism, but I think solidarity is an easier word to grasp. Justice and revenge, murder, and a last phrase, queer and feminist defense. So my name is Chad Benito Infante, and I am a professor of African American and Native American literature here in the Department of English at UMD. And I have to say that I'm really glad to be among this group of innovative writers and thinkers on Black study and Black literature. I come to my work through the example of my first and most important teachers, my mother and my grandmother. My mother is a teacher of English and Spanish, and because of that focus, she always spoke to me about both the Spanish and British colonization of Jamaica. And because of her example, I learned a lot about the history of the indigenous peoples in Jamaica. And so when I moved to the United States, I became interested in Native American literature and took an independent study course at my undergraduate institution, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Shout out to John Jay. In Native American literature with Professors Richard Perez, where I encountered the work of Leslie Marmon Silko. In Silko's collection entitled Storyteller, a collection of poems, short stories, autobiographical narratives, and photographs, she depicts various and numerous representations of anti-colonial revenge and murder, right? Multiple instances in which indigenous characters kill or dream of killing white characters. After seeing these depictions in Silko's work depicted again and again, when I went to graduate school, I began to see these representations everywhere in both Black and indigenous literature and in literature of the colonized generally. In my book, I use the phrase cool fratricide to represent and study the trope of retributive murder and feelings of racial revenge against the figure of the white colonizer in canonical African and Native American literature. This study focuses primarily on Black and Native women and queer writers from the late 20th century to the present. Building on James Baldwin's use of the term known him in the street, I argue that cool fratricide is a rendition of murder imagined by women and queer characters that expresses an ethic of care and defense in Black and indigenous literature. I maintain that retributive murder is a key philosophical and anti-colonial trope, central to both the form and content of these literatures, right? And oftentimes the form that it expresses is that of a question, that of an interrogative grammar. So my book manuscript, Cool Fratricide, Murder and Metaphysics in Black and Indigenous Literature, US Literature, is the first book-length comparative study of African American and Native American literature. It is also the first book-length study on revenge and justice in African American and Native American literature, with a broad genealogical arc that spans the colonial era to the 21st century. In my book, I use the phrase cool fratricide to study this trope and feelings of revenge, right? And to make interventions in key debates in Black and Native studies, as well as to argue for the centrality, argue that this trope is central, right, to the form of these literatures. I draw on GerShun Avilez's work, hi GerShun, in Radical Aesthetics that argues that queer and women writers from the 1960s and 70s, although they were maligned by the masculinist discourse of Black nationalism, that these queer and women writers experimented with Black nationalist discourse to create their own aesthetics. I draw on GerShun's argument and extend it to argue that they draw on murder specifically, violent murder and revolution, as tropes through which they think the dilemma and the philosophical questions on Black and Native life. And so my work then kind of indicates that these depictions of anti-colonial revenge and murder increase at moments of heightened political tension. And our current moment reflects such an instance where numerous representations of revenge and vengeance against the police are posted to the internet on Instagram, Twitter, and social media. And these representations also kind of is related to the political slogan that circulated during protests. And the slogan is, America should be happy that Black people want justice and not revenge. And I find the kind of appearance of these two, right, the desire and artistic rendition of revenge, but the political impetus against it, very interesting because they always seem to occur together. And I think that's how I also find contemporary representations or expressions of my work in our current political crisis.
Thanks, Chad. And our next speaker is Marisa Parham.
Good afternoon, everybody. And hello there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my keyword and the word I'll be working with today is digitality. And digitality is a word I use for thinking about the ways in which we can sort of historicize Black life over generations. So thinking about making and also thinking about unmaking. Of course, we have numerous heuristics through which we can think about this, but I particularly like digitality because one, it speaks to our current technological moment in a certain way, and two, it helps us think about the sort of possibilities embedded in digital technologies, while at the same time giving us a very firm grounding and foundation for thinking historically about the ways in which these technologies to which we might turn for certain kinds of new liberation or freedom are also simultaneously matters of oppression, right? So thinking this through and thinking with that constant push and pull, that constant give and take. I'm really excited, I think, to be here at Maryland working with this group because I think this is a particularly sort of prime way for thinking about the ways that things fit together. So I should say also that here at Maryland, I have two roles. I'm in the English department where, again, I work on matters of digitality and also Black environmental humanities. But I'm also here as a director of the African American Digital Humanities Initiative. And in that work, that's where I'm really working with people to think about the ways that we can use digital technologies to do new kinds of scholarship. So of course, I'm always there in various ways for thinking about articles and thinking about the sort of conceptual side of the relationship between technological formations and Black life. But through digital humanities work in the center, I'm also really interested in introducing people to new ways of doing work. For myself, examples of this kind of work are things like the project Breakdance, where I really think about what it means to activate your own archive as scholarship. So that was a fancy way of saying it's that moment when you're writing something and you realize that literally 80% of the stuff you read and thought about that inspired you are never going to make it into that final book or project. So how do we articulate and talk about that other 80%? And what about that 80% in fact transmits something special about the perspective on freedom through which you originally came to the practice or to the piece you wrote before you fell into disciplinary practice, right? So I try to think around the digital as a way of really pulling in more parts of what we think of as a thinking self, right? If we go very simply to thinking about writing itself, the essay form itself, and et cetera, as a kind of technology, and we understand that technology has limits, how do we think about Black freedom through the lens of what it means to release some of those limits? What are the new things that Black people specifically can make in these new forms? And how do those forms, in fact, resonate historically with the ways that Black people have always had to create outside of systems, right? So I use digitality as a way of thinking on the one side about the sort of instrumental, the making and the doing. But on the other side, for me, this is also a conceptual interest, right? It's thinking about the ways in which Black studies has always been a sort of technology studies, because Black studies has always had to be invested, as Mary Helen Washington started thinking about. We've always had to be invested in thinking about the why of things, while at the same time affirming the how and the when and the new. So this is sort of where I locate my work, and I think it'll be super exciting to work with many of you on thinking about this.
Thank you, Marisa. Our next speaker is Rion Scott.
Hello, everybody. How's everybody out there in internet land? I say that as if I'm going to get a response. Sitting here looking at this, I'm having fond memories of running into Chad or Julius outside my office. So hopefully we can do that soon. So I think my key word is insurrection. My work is focused on is fiction, focused on creating a world. In my books, my first two books, Insurrections and The World Doesn't Require You, they all take place in this fictional town called Cross River, Maryland, which has a unique history in that it was founded after the only successful slave revolt in this country. And in imagining that, I was inspired by the Haitian Revolution, and and the people in my town were inspired by the Haitian Revolution to set off their insurrection. So I see myself working sort of in a tradition of Black literature that touches on ideas of Black humanity, revolt, resistance. I'm working sort of in a tradition of people like Baldwin, Baraka, Ellison, Morrison, August Wilson, Randall Keenan, who just passed away. And one of the questions that I ask myself, or the work asks implicitly, is what happens to your humanity when you're in a state of constant rebellion, as Black people have been, not just in this country but worldwide. Sometimes it's low level. Sometimes it's as right now in this moment it's more outward. So I think there's nothing worse than a writer explaining their work. Only thing worse is a comedian explaining their jokes. So I think the best way to introduce it is I want to share to you my work in progress, tentatively titled Insurrection Day. And the work takes place both in the present time and the time of the insurrection. And Insurrection Day is the day, August 23rd, which they celebrate the insurrection every year. And the story will take place mostly on Insurrection Day. But this section I'm going to read you. I have no idea where it's going to land in the book. It's prior to the insurrection, and there are two people who don't know that they're going to be insurrectionists having a discussion. Olsagar and Longman are these two would-be insurrectionists. I want to dedicate this reading to Randall Keenan, who recently passed away, one of my mentors. True God from True God. The man they called Olsagar clutched in his hand a clump of wet, heavy Virginia earth. He examined it before he tossed it in the air. A gray cloud of tobacco smoke trailed from his mouth, and a breeze took both the smoke and the grains of wet dirt and blew them across Longman's face. "Oh man," Longman called. "You got some kind of problem? Something wrong with you, huh? Shit. Did I dirty up your rags? Nigga, why you always throwing dirt, huh? Don't you got nothing better to do? I bet straight man can find you some work. Plenty to do here. How come you don't do shit, huh? Live a charmed life, you and your smelly ass tobacco smoke. Every other nigga out here work. You don't do nothing. Take a look at this, long man. Come, take a look." Olsagar pointed to the earth beneath their feet and the peculiar patterns the disrupted dirt made as it scattered on the ground like clusters of stars. Longman leaned in close. He could almost read the earth from left to right. The cluster even twinkled like the stars on a clear night, Longman thought. He was learning to read the constellations and what they could tell him of this land. But also he was learning books. The first thing Sally told him about the words in a book is that you read them from left to right. And that's how he started to read the earth before the dirt turned to gibberish and such anger built in him. "Earth on earth," Olsagar said, "dust to dust." Longman kicked dirt onto the pattern. "Ain't nothing worse than when a nigga go out of his head. You looking in the dirt now. The next thing you'll be butt naked dancing on this hill. I wonder why so many niggas from this plantation that go all the way out their heads. Keep away from me. I don't know if the crazy is catching, boy. You gonna shut up and let me talk, or you gonna keep on with all that babble? The dust, that earth, that Lord, excuse me, I mean that land It's trying to talk to you. I don't know why I want to talk to a fool nigga like you. I was a fool nigga once myself, I suppose. What is it that you talking about, huh? Look there in that dirt. Don't you see it? I don't see nothing but some dirt, and I suspect you don't neither. Old Cigar pissed the still smoldering spent cigar from his fingertips and sat on a large rock. He coughed a bit, then sighed. I can't teach him, he said. Boy like that too ignorant. He bent and scooped some more earth into his closed fist, tossed it into the air. The wind caught the dirt just as it had reached its highest point. It appeared to linger in the air as if frozen. It blew one way and then another, passing over Longman, bathing him in a dirt shower. Yep, Old Cigar said, the dirt want to talk to you. I can't call it. The dirt got its own wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Rion. Our last speaker is Cecilia Shelton. Cecilia.
Hello, friends. I am grateful to be included here with my colleagues, most of whom I have never actually met in person, but I am looking forward to the day that I too can run into you in the hallways. So thank you for including me and allowing me to join you. I, like my colleagues, am an assistant professor in the Department of English, but I'm approaching our conversation from my sort of subdisciplinary perspective in technical and professional communication. And so I see my work rooted in that subdiscipline, in that field, but I also see it at the intersections of digital and cultural rhetorics. So I know that that's a mouthful. I'm gonna try to introduce myself by way of explaining a little bit what I mean when I say technical and professional communication, because that sometimes needs a little bit of unpacking from the preconceived notions that people bring to it, and then offering a clearer explanation of my work and how it is a sort of disruption to the norms in my field. So technical and professional communication is a field that's driven by action. So if I had to choose a word, a key word, I would say that it would be action. Even on the academic side of our discipline, when we're thinking about the theories that undergird our inquiry, we're concerned with how communication facilitates action. And so our disciplinary questions are, how does communication facilitate action? How do we move users to a place where they can make decisions? How do we solve problems? How do we communicate expertise in ways that are accessible to broad audiences? And the ways that most people come to recognize what that sort of means in a practical sense is through the communication genres that represent those actions. So think about things like emails, memos, letters, resumes, manuals, the documentation that engineers write for their code, how-tos, instructions, even things like public science, so the work that like a Dr. Fauci does, writing grants, press releases. All of these things are considered technical communication, and we also attend to the things that pertain to the communication situation, right? So how do users experience these genres? We are interested in the technology that enables all of this, and also how we manage content. So if you think of that as the picture of sort of the norm of tech comm, then the argument that my work makes is that the Black rhetorical tradition is full of technical communication. So I'm bringing together two sort of modes of inquiry that are not intuitive for people to connect, particularly in technical and professional communication. And so it usually needs some unpacking, and I'm gonna make the case for that here with you today. If we think about the Black rhetorical tradition and some sort of benchmarks or rhetorical practices that are probably familiar to most of us, things like the Green Book, where you have Black travelers navigating a Jim Crow era, trying to make decisions about where it is safe to eat, sleep, and spend money. If you think about things like work songs or Negro spirituals, if you think about the Black Panther Party, their 10-point plan, or their free breakfast program. And the focus of my most recent project, if you think about the long tradition of activism in the Black community, and in particular in this moment, how the Black Lives Matter is working both online and in the streets, then what you see is a pattern of Black rhetors who are drawing on our unique cultural rhetorical practices to facilitate action, right? Action that moves us as individuals, us as a community toward freedom for ourselves. And, you know, we can make arguments about the ways that the actions that our rhetorical practices have moved our country and prompted the development and movement toward justice and equity in many contexts, and provided models for people beyond the US context. So my work is to make that argument to a field where that's a hard sell, technical and professional communication, for lots of reasons. We can talk about that, but not just to make that argument, but to back up and to think about the theoretical, the methodological, and pedagogical racism that has excluded what for me is a pretty obvious connection, right? How come this argument is a new one in my field? And then for me to do the theoretical, methodological, and pedagogical work to make space for contributions like mine moving forward. So I'm excited to be in conversation with everybody to make connections across our sort of perspectives.
Thanks, Cecilia. And we are going to spend a few minutes asking the panelists to discuss these issues among themselves. I have not introduced myself, so I will just say that I am Mary Helen Washington. I'm the Distinguished University Professor in the English department. My work is on the 1950s, so when I hear the word insurrection, I think, yay, that's my work, insurrection. It's about Black writers during the Cold War and the way they resisted the kinds of repression that were very much a part of that McCarthyite period. As I was listening to all of you, I was trying to come up with some words that would help us to mount a discussion and that would bring us all in conversation with one another. And so the words that I have here are capacious, justice, and insurrection, maybe relevance. And those words come out of my thinking about how old Black studies is. I think of it going back to the 1970s when I started in Black studies as kind of the modern iteration of Black studies. But, you know, we could take it all the way back to 1926 with Carter Woodson and his institution of Negro History Week, which then became Black History Month. So the things that are swirling around in my head are, first of all, relevance, the way in which African American studies continues to have these really important connections to everything that's going on right now. Black Lives Matter. The other one is capaciousness. And as I listen to all of you, I'm thinking of how this field has grown and how many different kinds of trajectories and directions that it's taken, and all of your work represents that. So to open up the discussion among you, I wonder if you think about any of those issues, how Black studies has grown, and how it has continued to have this kind of capaciousness and relevance and relationship to justice. So, GerShun, you want to kick off the discussion?
Of course, I'd love to. Mary Helen, thank you for those kind of provocative thoughts to get us started. And I love what you said, because I was thinking about it in relationship to what Cecilia was just saying. And I think there is a way that the field, of course, over time, it grows as it melds with other fields and things like that. But I also think, listening to this conversation, there's a way in which that growth also reflects how we're still going back and relearning Black studies. So part of Cecilia's point was that this idea of making a case, but in a way that case is already there, we just haven't recognized it. I also think there's a way that even in my work, I think when my first book came out, I think it maybe shocked people that I was trying to think about the Black arts movement alongside sexuality studies or queer of color critique. But the argument I made there is that it might be the case that us linking them together is odd, but the time period, people were making certain kinds of moves that we don't see as clearly looking back. So I think part of what everyone is doing, and there's a line I want to go to from when Marisa was talking, she said that, which I think connects all of us together, new forms make possible or lead to new freedoms. And I think that's kind of what we're all talking about. But sometimes those new forms, they're not, or at least from my perspective, they're not always new, but they're new to us. Like in terms of us recognizing that they're there and understanding the different kinds of strategies and kind of activities people were doing in the past that we're just now finding a language for to fully understand. So because in all these cases, people were trying to find a way just to be free, right? And they had to find some form in which to do that. And I think my job as a critic is to help us understand how that happened, how they found that form, and how they have that language in ways that the present doesn't always look like the past. Sometimes you have to go back and try to figure out how they were doing what they were doing. So I hope that's not too scattered, but I think that's kind of what I was hearing based on what you were saying, Mary Helen.
Yeah, I like that a lot, that we are kind of relearning the field as we recreate the field. Chad?
So I wanted to also say that I really also appreciate the capaciousness, Mary Helen, to your point, right, that no matter what object, topic, or subject I take up, I know that there's an angle from which Black studies has approached, right, that concept or that thing, and that makes me really happy in one instance, but also it means that we have to do this work for every time there's a new object, right, or every time, right, and so the kind of richness and fullness of the work is also indicative of the longevity of the problems that we kind of are trying to hash through. But the thing that I also really like about one of the kind of contemporaneous strains of Black studies, right, is the debate between Afro-pessimism and Black optimism, both of which, and the thing I love about that debate is both of them begin with the premise that Blackness is the beginning and the end, right? And I love that idea, right, that it can answer a lot of questions that we don't even assume that it might be able to answer, that it can answer, be a tool for investigating kind of things that we've not thought about, or things that we've, to GerShun's point, forgotten that we've even remembered, right? And so that's what I like about that conversation in Black studies. Sorry, it's kind of really opened up, for me, a broad, kind of unending expanse of conversation about what Blackness could mean.
Okay.
I just wanted to kind of, I think it feels like capaciousness is the word that is resonating, across the panel. And I think for me, one of the things that always sort of satisfies me, maybe is a good word, about Black studies is the ways that the Black intellectual tradition is always and primarily, I would argue, like outside of the field of study. Like we are making meaning and theorizing in our lived experiences, in large part because we've been excluded from many spaces. But even when we come together in a field of study, in the academy, on a panel, I love that we know from and we are drawing from. Chad, you mentioned the importance of your mother and grandmother and the ways that you are theorizing and doing your work. And I feel like my lived experience as a Black woman informs my whole sort of epistemological stance toward my work and what I can see, right? And I think that means that we are, that we are theorizing and making meaning and sharing and disseminating that meaning. I am, but so is the rest of my community outside of the academy. And I think that part of what's important to me in technical communication, this idea of like ethos is really important because of how important expertise is. So it's important. Having an expert status is marked by like being credentialed, right? And I'm arguing that you can have other kinds of expertise, right? And so the expertise of the lived experience of being Black and what it means to navigate systems of oppression and to do that successfully and to maintain a culture, a language, joy, rest, right? These are things that I would argue reflect a kind of expertise that then can get communicated, which is my argument, and can facilitate action. So I just love that Black Studies is and is not the academy. And I think that is part of the roominess and the space that we can draw on.
Oh,
yeah, and I think we can, as a field, we can push that even farther, right? I think what you're talking about, the mother, the grandmother, the family member who doesn't have the credentials per se, the ways in which they've been able to be critical thinkers, I think we can go even a bit deeper. And so I was thinking, I've been working on this chapter. Chad had a chance to read a part of it. That's about the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. 100 years of freedom, right? And it's 1963, it's a civil rights movement. And you have Black people who are teachers, who are librarians, and they're offering up these really complex philosophies of Blackness and Black ontology. And they're saying things like, okay, it's 1963, 100 years later, we're half free, we're part slave and part man. Right. And when I think about that being said in 1963, it's already sort of laying so much of the groundwork for the critical conversations that we often frame as new around Black ontology, around social life and social death. And so I think a part of what we have to do in this next phase of Black studies is to kind of approach the field with a kind of investment in novelty, with an investment in discovery, with a kind of sense of cosmic urgency that sort of mirrors the 70s and 80s when we were interested in discovering novels and discovering writers. And so I guess a part of what I'm saying is that there's so much beneath the surface of the archive of Black studies that we haven't tapped into. And so rather than I think it's good that we're branching out into all these fields, right? This is why we're all here. But I also think that there has to be a kind of return to the archive itself, to scratch the surface, to see what else is there that we haven't sort of posed for critical thought in the way that we can.
Yeah, I think when I think about literature, I think of it as thinking of giving people an emotional and intellectual lexicon to discuss things that seem sort of amorphous. And when it comes to Black literature, there's so much in Black life. There's so much conflicting emotions, conflicting ideas that are often very, very hard to articulate. And what I see in literature today, when we talk about capaciousness, you got someone like Jericho Brown creating forms to encompass everything that he is, queer Black Southern, creating a whole new form of poetry, and it's interesting, I think, to look at the places where we have to create this whole new dialogue, this whole new language, and also the places which we're stuck. I think of the ways in which Black male writers, including myself, are still riffing off Ellison and have been forever. And where that's good, and how do we get past that, or if it's necessary to get past that. I think there are things that James Baldwin has done that we're going to be riffing off of for a very long time, and so I think of the places. I think of us. I'm sorry, my son just walked in the room in a Spider-Man costume. It got me confused. But so I'm thinking of where we're expanding and where we are where we're riffing.
I think that notion of expansion is critical, and I'll push a little bit. Yes, reaching the archive, yes, thinking about the underexplored, but if we were to flip that a little bit, I think it's really important always in these moments to also have a conversation about, I never know quite how to frame it, but, and I implicate myself in this because I used the word earlier in my own introduction, but pushing back against the instrumentalization of knowledge about Black life and the study of Black life, right? I mean, if you actually look, and this is the thing about canonicity, this is, I think, part of what Cecilia's getting at about where is the proper place where we even locate writing, where we locate, right? What are we looking at? You know, and I'm thinking about the ways in which one of the things I'm really interested in my work are the moments when authors sort of emerge, right? Black authors emerge and where the reemerge, right? And where the conditions under which that reemergence is made possible. And also thinking about how the lack of sometimes disciplinary language around the work of Black scholars, you know, becomes a problem that we have to be careful not to reiterate ourselves by imagining, right, where there's an absence, there is no absence. It's just a matter of language, right? Just to say some of what's been said already differently again. And so an example I'm going to give is like I'm thinking about someone like Charles Chestnut. And I'm thinking how I'm always drawn to writers who, in the moments of their own work, were deeply perspicacious, right? So they're writing, they're, you know, gardening, they're working as scientists, they're working as politicians, they're working as teachers. I'm thinking about, and we all know this, but the ways in which, you know, Du Bois isn't just a sociologist, you know, he's also writing fiction, he's also writing souls, he's also writing. And so for each of these scholars, I'm thinking about I can't stop, I'll stop. But, you know, so I'm thinking about, you know, all these writers and all these thinkers and how their own approach was really deeply based in this notion that everything about their lives and their observation of the lives of the people around them constitute a worthwhile archive. But what happens over time in the sedimentation, right, of how we talk about people, right? The example I always give is that sort of moment where, you know, the question of, you know, to what extent is Du Bois read rigorously in intro sociology courses? To what extent do we read Du Bois deeply when I teach like speculative fiction, right? Which of his works and which pieces do I bring into that, for instance? So thinking about all these sort of deep, deep cross currents, as we know, in Black studies and in the literary and cultural study of Black life, that, you know, how do we constantly forefront that so that we're not in a defensive place of trying to make an argument about moving forward. So this is a really fancy way of saying that for me, for instance, when I'm talking about digitality, I argue, I think very stridently sometimes, that I'm not talking about anything new, right? So a social media platform is simply a new formation of an old thing. And that's not to flatten everything out, but it's actually incredibly important to be able to account for the ways in which Black scholars, Black theorists did their work across places. And this is also the place, to go back to a word GerShun also used again, of thinking about novelty and thinking about the new and experimentation as well, because experimentation is something that the Academy generally does not necessarily do well with in its moment, either historically or in the present.
Thank you for this, for the discussion. The discussion is just, it's so fabulous. I'm here taking notes. One of the things that I am so happy to hear are the names of African-American literary and cultural figures that we all work with, and you know, that are part of the staple of our work. So I'm hearing James Baldwin and Ellison. Have I heard any women here? I want to name Paul Marshall because it strikes me as that what Marisa was saying about how we talk about these writers and when they emerge and when they are allowed to emerge has a lot to do with how canons get created. And I was just thinking about Paul Marshall because she's one of these people who brings the Caribbean and African Americans in the United States together in her work. And that's part of the reason she, in some ways, it's part of the reason she doesn't get read, because we haven't been ready for that kind of international and transnational view of African Americanism. Any questions there? Or we'll just continue. I would just ask you to go around again and to name one of the writers that has been important to your work.
You asked if there are women who mentioned. I did mention Toni Morrison. I'm gonna mention her again. There's no more important writer to my work than her. And in which she shows a lot of things. But you know, she shows the level of there's a level of intellectualism that that it's important, that I think a lot of fiction tries to eschew intellectualism and think of it as simply an emotional enterprise. But I think it's important that she shows how deeply entwined intellectualism and emotion are. And her work asks very, 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 very tough questions. And it's I don't mind that some of it goes over my head at times, because that just means I'm just going to keep going back at it and hitting that groove.
So we've gotten one from Chauncey, that is, what exactly is the danger of instrumentality and or canonization in Black studies?
Mary Helen and I were talking about canonicity, and because part of what my works think about is the centrality of the trope of retribution. To the canon, to those most celebrated works of African American literature and Native American literature. And I guess, what we discussed was that a lot of these central texts emerge in relationship to writers and their communities, but when they get taken up in classroom and put on syllabi, oftentimes with not being taught by someone who is in fact African American or Native American, right? That might seem to be a position. It results in a position in which more white scholars are teaching Black studies, and in Black studies department or in English departments teaching Black studies than Black scholars or Native scholars. And I think that is one of the dilemmas that happens when we canonize works, but don't then correlatively make sure that there are African American and Native American scholars enough to teach those works. And so, I think that's one of the problems of instrumentalization. But I'm pretty sure someone else probably has something sharper.
If I can just say, I think I won't call it a problem, but I think and the language was used as danger. One of the challenges, I'll focus on canonization, is that we all know this, canonization means something gets left out. Right, that's really what canonization means. And thinking in terms of, for example, how anthologies work, and Mary Helen's done really great work about anthologies, but also have written really great anthologies. But she talks about how the act of creating an anthology, which we can think of as kind of a canonizing act, can be incredibly helpful for education purposes or critical purposes, but it's the leaving out that I just don't want to lose sight of. So almost all of my work effectively is recovery work. It's looking at writers that get neglected or not talked about as much for whatever reason, and trying to make a case for what we lose by that neglect, right? So I think that is, and this doesn't, I'm not making the argument that we should not canonize, but I do think I always want us to be very mindful of that act. It is an act of creation. In an act of creation, there are things that aren't no longer part of the conversation that were historically part of the milieu of the time of the works coming out, the time period.
I just want to add real quick to the question of the danger of instrumentality, just the notion that, the danger of being exploited, basically, just thinking about the ways that particularly the labor of Black women can be exploited. So I'm thinking about right now sort of the call to listen to Black women. And on the one hand, you see an opportunity to foreground the meaning making and the leadership of Black women. On the other hand, there's a way in which the labor of Black women can get consumed, but Black women themselves are not listened to or protected. And so it's almost like our contributions, our labor, our work becomes a tool that then gets detached from our own experiences and advocating for, our goals, our needs. And so, I think that it's difficult to parse out maybe how to navigate that always. But I think that's something that's important to think about, especially right now, because I think it's sort of front and center in our politics.
Actually, Cecilia, there's a question, the third question I want to jump to, because I think it relates to what you're saying. So I'll ask the question, let's let you jump off on it if you want to talk more about it. The question from Jamie is, how do you all think the current socio-political climate and the state of the country transforms the purpose of African American studies? And I think this resonates with what you've been saying. So I don't know if anyone, Cecilia or anyone wants to jump in this question about how what's going on in the country or our world relates to our field of study.
I think to add to what Cecilia was saying, we actually as a field have to be aware of what's going on and ethically the ways in which we're being instrumentalized. And so, you know, there is this pattern of whenever there's some kind of racial violence in this country, there's a kind of overinvestment or a kind of increase in investment in certain minority fields as a kind of response to that, as a kind of desire for repair. And I think as Cecilia is saying, the minority oppressed people often end up being the ones further exploited, the ones called to do more work, even as they are compensated for that work. And so I think this is where the field of performance studies is actually really useful in terms of understanding how that instrumentality has some kind of ethical violation sometimes. And so when you look across the institution, you have more webinars like this, you have you know, phrases before performance events like this land belonged to this native tribe. You have emails that say something to the tune of we're interested in racial justice. And so it can seem on the surface of things that an institution is committed, quote unquote, to the struggle as it were. And so I think we as a field have to ask constantly what kind of structural changes are accommodating, are accompanying those sort of performative events that kind of invest in justice, as it were, without always enacting social and structural change.
We have about 2 minutes, and
Sure.
I need the last 60 seconds.
Okay, I'll try to get one more question out, Sangeeta's question, which was which it relates to what you were to Julius's question. I was wondering, is there a rupture between insurrection and murder and the kind of refusal to be defined precisely by violence and bondage in the example given by Julius of the theater production in the cotton field? So actually that kind of brings together Chad, Rion, and Julius's ideas in one question. I don't know if anyone wants to kind of respond to that at all.
So, I mean, in my work, I think about the difference between murder and say revolution or insurrection. It's the difference between, right, murder is wholeheartedly right, a principle of the law, whereas revolution and insurrection, right, assume the overturning of the law in total. And for Fanon, right, murder produces cleansing violence, i.e. it brings to it can produce, right, desires for murder or actual representations of murder, right, can produce cleansing consciousness, which can bring the colonized to an awareness of their position. But if it doesn't ever move beyond that, it becomes selfish because it becomes invested in merely self-realization. And so you move, the only way you get from the kind of emptiness of murder to the kind of fullness of insurrection and revolution is to transform that individual instance into a collective instance. And so for Fanon, then you get from revolutionary violence, right, from right, murderous violence, revolutionary violence, through transforming it from an individual instance to a communal instance. And I think that's how I think about that tension between those two concepts, right? One is singular and one is communal.
Okay, we are out of time, so I want to say there, if you want to continue this conversation informally, if you register for the event, Tita Chico sent you a link to go to another Zoom so we could continue this conversation for those who are interested. So please, if you want to keep talking or keep thinking together and not just the panelists, you can go to that Zoom site through the link, which you should have gotten based on your registration. Mayor Helen.
Thank you all. I will see you again in the spring for our spring roundtable on Black feminism. Thank you, panel, for not only being a part of this today, but really forwarding the whole work of African American studies in your wonderful, brilliant comments today. Thank you.